Legendary voices in Hollywood rarely tremble, but in the quiet of a dimly lit recording booth, Gary Oldman's did, soft and fragile, as if the weight of 7 decades was finally pressing down on his chest. He leaned forward, eyes glassy, and whispered that there was a truth he had carried since the early days of his American career, a truth tied to Rob Reiner that had followed him through every award, every red carpet smile, every lonely hotel room at 3 in the morning when the applause faded and only regret remained. He spoke slowly, as if each word cost him something. He remembered meeting Reiner when he was still trying to prove himself in Hollywood, when his accent and intensity made people curious but cautious. Rob was powerful then, a gatekeeper with a warm grin and a reputation for making dreams come true. And Gary, still bruised from a messy divorce and the quiet battle he fought with addiction, believed in him more than he believed in himself. He said that in those early conversations, Rob made promises that felt like lifelines, promises of roles that would finally show the world who Gary Oldman really was, not just the chameleon, not just the troubled genius, but the man beneath it all who wanted to be seen and loved. As Gary's voice cracked, he admitted that what hurt the most wasn't just what happened, but what never did. There were scripts that never arrived, phone calls that were never returned, and a sense of being slowly erased from a future he thought he had been invited into. He described sitting alone in his trailer one night. After a long day of filming something he had taken only to keep the lights on, and realizing that Rob Reiner's silence was louder than any rejection letter. It felt personal, he said, like a door had been closed not on a career, but on a friendship he had believed was real. He drifted into memories of that time in Holly. When everyone was connected, when you'd run into people like Tom Cruise, Meryl Streep, and Jack Nicholson at the same quiet dinners, all of them pretending to be fine while hiding their own fears. Gary said he once watched Rob laugh with those giants, and for a moment he felt invisible, like the kid from South London who had snuck into a world that never truly wanted him. That invisibility fed the darkness inside him, the same darkness that later pushed him into rehab, where he would sit on cold plastic chairs and wonder how much of his pain came from his own choices and how much came from being let down by people he trusted. There was a long pause, and Gary wiped his eyes as he spoke about his children, how they would ask why he was always so tired, so distant, and how he could never explain that a part of him was still waiting for a call that would never come. He said Rob Reiner never knew how deeply those broken promises cut into his family life, how every missed opportunity meant another month of uncertainty, another argument at home, another night when he questioned his worth. He talked about his mother's illness back in England, how he wanted so badly to make her proud before it was too late, and how each silence from Rob felt like another nail in a coffin of hopes he was too afraid to bury. When Gary finally looked up, there was a strange mix of anger and sadness in his eyes. He said this wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about dragging a man's name through the mud. It was about telling the truth he had swallowed for years. The truth that success doesn't protect you from heartbreak, and that sometimes the people who smile the widest can leave the deepest scars. He leaned back, exhausted, and whispered that what Rob Reiner never realized was that by walking away, he had taken a piece of Gary's faith in Hollywood with him, a piece that Gary was still to find even now, at 67, with more memories behind him than ahead. Gary took a deep breath, as if he were about to step into a storm he had avoided for decades. He said there was a night, one that still visited him in dreams, when Rob Reiner had invited him to a quiet dinner away from the studios and the agents, a place where famous faces could drop their masks for just a moment. The air had been heavy with unspoken expectations, and Gary remembered feeling hopeful in a way that almost scared him. Rob talked about a project that could change everything, a story of broken men and redemption that felt eerily close to Gary's own life, and Gary left that restaurant believing that maybe, finally, someone in Hollywood truly understood him. But the weeks that followed were a slow, painful unraveling. The project disappeared without explanation, and when Gary tried to reach out, he was met with polite excuses and then nothing at all. He said it was around that time he began drinking again, not the reckless chaos of his younger years, but a quiet, Lonely kind of drinking that happens when you're sitting in a hotel room with city lights flickering outside and no one to talk to. He admitted that part of him blamed Rob for that relapse. Not because Rob owed him anything, but because Rob had given him something more dangerous than rejection. Hope that Gary's voice softened when he spoke about running into Rob years later at an award show. Cameras were flashing. Celebrities like Al Pacino and Nicole Kidman were laughing nearby, and everything looked perfect to the world. Rob hugged him, warm and familiar, as if no time had passed, and said they should talk soon. Gary nodded and smiled for the photographers, but inside he felt a hollow ache because he knew that talk would never come. That was the moment, he said, when he realized that Hollywood could be more cruel in its kindness than in its cruelty. He began to cry when he talked about his faith. Gary said the hardest part about telling the truth now was that Rob Reiner was no longer here to answer back. Death has a strange way of turning complicated people into myths, he whispered, and Rob had already become one of those legends Hollywood preferred not to question. When the news broke that Rob had quietly passed after a long illness, Gary had been on set, wearing another man's face for the camera, while inside he felt something collapse. There would be no final conversation, no chance to ask why things ended the way they did, no chance to hear the words he had waited for all those years. He remembered the last voicemail Rob ever left him, a message filled with warmth and regret that came too late. Rob's voice had sounded weak, almost fragile, as he said he hoped they would catch up soon, that he had always admired Gary more than he ever knew. Gary admitted he listened to that message over and over, trying to decide if it was an apology or just another gentle goodbye wrapped in Hollywood politeness. By the time he finally worked up the courage to call back, Rob was already gone, taken by a sickness no one outside his inner circle had fully understood. Gary spoke about the rumors that swirled after Rob's death, the quiet conversations in studio hallways and at private memorials. People like Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese would lower their voices when Rob's name came up, as if there were stories buried beneath the public praise. Some said Rob had carried guilt over the people he'd left behind, careers he had promised to lift but somehow forgot. Others said he had been battling more than just a physical illness, that depression had haunted him in his final years, a shadow that even fame and success couldn't chase away. There was a moment when Gary broke down completely, describing how he had stood alone at Rob's funeral, watching faces he recognized from. Decades of filmmaking quietly mourned a man they thought they knew. He said he wanted to scream, not in anger, but in grief for the complicated truth that would now never be fully spoken. Rob had been kind and careless, brilliant and distant, and Gary had loved and resented him in equal measure. That contradiction was now sealed in the grave, leaving only memories and unanswered questions behind. He confessed that sometimes he dreamed of Rob, not as the powerful director, but as the tired man who left that last voicemail. In those dreams, Rob would apologize without words, and Gary would finally feel the weight lift from his chest. But waking up was always painful, because real life offered no such closure. All that remained were fragments of a relationship that had shaped his career and wounded his heart in ways he was still trying to understand. Gary wiped his eyes and said this was why he was finally speaking now. When someone dies, the truth doesn't die with them. It just becomes harder to tell. And somewhere between the public legend of Rob Reiner and the private man Gary had known, there was a story that had been waiting too long to be heard. The room felt colder as Gary went deeper into memories he had never shared, even with the people closest to him. He said that after Rob Reiner's death, he found an old notebook tucked away in a forgotten box, filled with scribbled ideas and half-written letters he had never sent. One of them was addressed to Rob, written during a night when loneliness and anger had blurred together, and as Gary read it now, his hands shook. In it, he had begged Rob to tell him the truth about why he was pushed aside, why the warmth had turned into distance, and whether any of it had ever been real. He described a phone call he once received from a mutual friend, someone who had been close to Rob in his final years. The voice on the other end had been nervous, almost guilty, and had hinted that Rob had carried regrets about certain actors he had hurt without meaning to. Gary never learned all the details, but the implication haunted him, that somewhere inside Rob's fading mind there had been a recognition of the damage he'd done. That thought was both comforting and devastating, because it meant Rob had known, and yet had still waited too long to reach out. Gary spoke about his own health, how the years of stress, addiction, and emotional strain had left their mark on his body. Doctors had warned him that his heart was weaker now, that he needed to slow down, but he said slowing down only gave his mind more space to wander back to the past. He would lie awake at night thinking about Rob, about all the paths his career and life might have taken if things had been different. That constant replay of what-ifs, he said, was its own kind of illness, one that no medicine could cure. There was a quiet moment when Gary mentioned his wife and children, how they had watched him wrestle with ghosts they could never fully see. He admitted that he had pushed them away at times, lost in a sadness that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with unfinished business. They had begged him to let go, to forgive, but forgiveness felt impossible when the person you needed answers from was already gone. In that absence, the pain just echoed louder as he told a story about running into a young actor at a film festival, someone who had idolized both Gary and Rob. The actor spoke about Rob like a hero, and Gary smiled politely, but inside he felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. He realized then that Rob's public image would live on untouched, while the private wounds he left behind would be carried quietly by people like him. That imbalance felt unfair, yet somehow deeply Hollywood, where the story that sells is rarely the whole story. To be why the end of his confession, Gary looked exhausted but strangely lighter, as if speaking these truths was the first step towards setting himself free. He said he didn't want Rob to be remembered as a villain, only as a human being who made mistakes that rippled outward in ways he never intended. As the cameras rolled, capturing every fragile breath, Gary closed his eyes and whispered that some stories don't end with answers. Only with the courage to finally speak them out loud, Gary's voice grew softer, almost distant, as if you're no longer in the room, but somewhere deep inside his own memories. He said that after Rob Reiner's passing, a strange silence settled over Hollywood, a silence that only comes when a powerful figure is gone and everyone is quietly deciding which parts of the story will survive. In that quiet, Gary felt both forgotten and strangely seen, as if the truth he had carried was finally rising to the surface, even if no one else could hear it yet. He spoke about attending a small private gathering in Rob's honor, where people like Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan shared warm stories about the man who had once guided their careers. Gary listened, smiling through the ache, knowing that his own story with Rob would never be told in that room. When it was his turn to speak, he said only a few careful words about gratitude and complexity, leaving out the pain because it felt too raw, too dangerous to reveal in a place built on polite memory. Later that night, alone in his hotel, he wept not just for Rob, but for himself and all the things he had never been able to say. The illness that took Rob, Gary revealed, had been long and cruel, stripping away his strength and, in some ways, his pride. There were rumors that in his final months, Rob had asked about people he had lost touch with, names that surprised those around him. Gary's was one of them, though the message reached him too late to matter. Knowing that his name had crossed Rob's lips near the end filled him with a bittersweet comfort that hurt almost as much as the years of silence. Gary reflected on how grief changes a person, how it softens anger and sharpens regret. He admitted that sometimes he imagined what a final conversation with Rob would have sounded like, whether there would have been tears, apologies, or just a quiet understanding between two aging men who had both been wounded by the same industry they loved. That imagined goodbye became a kind of therapy for him, a way to process a relationship that had ended without closure. There was a haunting stillness as he described walking through old studio lots where he and Rob had once dreamed of future projects. The buildings looked the same, but everything else felt different, as if the past were whispering through the empty sound stages. Gary said he could almost hear Rob's voice, full of ideas and enthusiasm, reminding him that not everything they shared had been painful. Those memories, he realized, were as important as the hurt, because they proved that what they had once felt was real. As the confession drew toward another quiet pause, Gary admitted that telling this story wasn't about rewriting history, but about honoring the complicated truth of it. He wanted people to know that behind every legend there are fragile human connections, and behind every public success there are private losses. He took a long breath, steadying himself, and said that even now, he was still learning how to live with both the love and the sorrow Rob Reiner had left behind. Gary seemed to gather what little strength he had left, as if he knew he was approaching the edge of something he had been holding back his entire life. He said that speaking about Rob Reiner like this felt almost like speaking to him, like finally breaking through the wall of silence that had stood between them for so long. In that moment, he wasn't the celebrated actor, not the man who had won every possible honor, but just a tired soul still aching for a goodbye he never received. He talked about how age changes the way you remember, how at 67 the past doesn't feel distant anymore, but close enough to touch. Faces blur, but emotions stay sharp. He said Rob's face sometimes appeared to him in the mirror when he was washing his own, both of them older than they ever expected to be, both carrying the weight of choices they could no longer undo. That reflection, he admitted, frightened him, because it reminded him how little time any of them truly have to make things right. Gary revealed that after Rob died, he tried to write a letter one last time, even though he knew it would never be read. In it, he thanked Rob for believing in him once, even if that belief had faded. He also wrote about the hurt, about how the silence had almost broken him, and how he wished they could have talked honestly before illness and pride took that chance away. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it inside an old book Rob had once given him, a quiet ritual of closure that no one else would ever see. There was a tremor in his voice as he spoke about his own mortality, about the fear that he might leave behind the same kind of unfinished stories. He didn't want his children or his fans to one day wonder what he had meant or what he had failed to say. Rob's death had taught him that fame doesn't protect you from regret, and that even legends can die with their hearts full of things left undone. That realization, he said, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. As the confession neared its end, Gary looked directly into the camera with eyes that were tired but honest. He said he didn't want Rob Reiner to be remembered only as a myth or a saint, but as a man who was as flawed and vulnerable as anyone else. Their story, he believed, was a reminder that even in the brightest spotlight, human connections can slip through the cracks, leaving scars that last longer than any film. The room fell into a deep, heavy silence as Gary let those words settle. You could almost feel the years of pain, love, and longing hanging in the air, waiting for someone, anyone, to truly hear them. And in that stillness, it felt as though Rob's spirit and Gary's wounded heart were finally sharing the same quiet space, bound together by a truth that had waited far too long to be spoken. Gary did not speak for a long time after that. The cameras kept rolling, but he simply sat there, breathing slowly, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was barely more than a whisper. He said that sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and his body aches from years of work and years of living, he imagines Rob Reiner standing somewhere just out of sight, no longer powerful, no longer sick, just human again. In those moments, all the anger fades, and what remains is a deep, aching sadness for two men who once believed in each other and somehow lost their way. He admitted that telling this story was not about clearing his name or rewriting Rob's. It was about breaking the spell of silence that had haunted him for so long. Carrying untold truth, he said, is like carrying a second heart inside your chest, one that beats with pain instead of blood. Letting it out, even now, felt like finally setting that burden down. For the first time in years, he felt a small sense of peace, not because everything was resolved, but because it was no longer hidden. Gary spoke softly about forgiveness, not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that allows you to keep living despite it. He said he was learning to forgive Rob, not because Rob had earned it, but because he himself needed it. Holding on to the hurt had nearly destroyed him, and he refused to let it define the rest of his life. Somewhere beyond memory and regret, he hoped Rob had also found a kind of peace free from the illness and the weight of the choices he never got to explain. As the final moments of the confession unfolded, Gary looked more fragile than any character he had ever played, but also more real. He said that fame, awards, and applause mean very little when you are alone with your thoughts. What truly stays with you are the people who touched your life, for better or worse. Rob Reiner was one of those people for him, a figure woven into his story in ways that could never be undone, no matter how much time passed. The last thing Gary said was that truth does not always come with justice, and it does not always come with closure. Sometimes it only comes with the quiet courage to finally speak. As the camera slowly pulled away, his eyes filled with tears, not of anger, but of a deep, enduring love and loss that had shaped him forever. And in that quiet, heartbreaking moment, it felt as though the long, complicated story between Gary Oldman and Rob Reiner had at last found a place to rest, not in the headlines, but in the fragile, human space where all unfinished stories eventually belong.